Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming to our final keynote event, which is a self-advocate panel. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists today. We have Amy Gravino, who will be a panelist member and she'll also be moderating the panel. Just some housekeeping rules. If we're going to spend the first chunk of time going through some pre-created questions that Amy will introduce, and then everyone will have the chance to respond. We're saving about 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions from the audience. And we have some microphones here that we'll be bringing to you just so everyone can hear. So once it's time for audience questions, if you can put your hand up, we'll be happy to bring those microphones to you.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me okay? Thank you so much, Rose. Good afternoon, everyone. There we go. I hope you've all had a stimulating and productive and interesting day, and we're so glad you're joining us here for the closing keynote panel. Before we begin, it's very important for me to let you know, and I'm sure you've heard this expression before, that if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And so all of us who are here today to speak with you, we are representing ourselves. We obviously cannot represent the entirety of the very vast and wide autism spectrum and all the different perspectives that exist on it. So we are here to share with you our stories and our experiences. So we're going to get started. We'll start by introducing ourselves. And we'll start down with Hallie, and we'll come on down the line. So share with us your name, where you're from, and where do you live now? And what are you doing, school or job?
I'm Hallie Hobie-Murray. I am from and currently reside in Richmond, Virginia. I run a business, Gordian Partners, LLC, based in Richmond, Virginia. And I'm a law school graduate from William & Mary.
Hi, I'm Andrew Side. I'm 23 years old. I'm originally from Cincinnati, Ohio, residing here in Charlottesville currently with my parents, and I'm in a transition phase at school at Piedmont Virginia Community College, PVCC, doing some cybersecurity, and I'm interested doing information technology, software testing, and data entry.
Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, my name is I'm a resident of Charlottesville. I'm a graduate of University of Virginia Law, and I ghostwrite memoranda and pleadings for lawyers all over the country. I'm also married for 18 years and have 2 kids, one of whom is also on the spectrum.
And as I mentioned, my name is Amy Gravino. I am not a resident of Charlottesville. This is my first time in Charlottesville. I live in Montclair, New Jersey, but I'm born and raised in New York. And I'm the president and founder of Ascot Consulting, through which I do professional public speaking, which I've been doing for 13 years, and I travel all over the world presenting about autism. And I'm also an autism consultant, and I consult with school districts, parents, families, and I provide mentoring services as well for young adults on the spectrum. Okay, great, so now we all know who we are. Wonderful. So when we're thinking about a lot of the advice that people are looking for when it comes to autism, people often ask, what would you tell your younger self? If you could, or if you could give your younger self or your family some advice. So knowing what you know now, what advice do you think you'd give to your younger self? Hallie?
I guess I would tell myself to keep being as stubborn as I was. It was truly that stubbornness and that tenacity kind of sitting. I remember in middle school, I used to sit in my guidance counselor's office until she let me take advanced courses. Because, when you're a kid who has an IEP, people assume that you can't take advanced courses. So I would tell myself to keep being as stubborn and to keep really fighting for what I needed to be able to be as successful as I wanted to be in my life, because that is what helped me to get to where I am today.
Thank you, Hallie. Andrew?
Yeah, transition to adulthood is often very tough. It's actually a lot harder, and transitions, as usual, are going to be very hard for individuals on the spectrum, and there are not a lot of transitioning services that are out there. And people with autism, that could be tough, actually. It could be a lot harder. And the more experiences that I could have in terms of, doing a lot of things and making accomplishments and going to events and participating in all these good sport programs could actually build a lot of great skills with someone with autism like myself. And the more experiences that I could have, the better someone could be. And like myself, and I'm thankful for going to the University of Cincinnati, being enrolled in the Transition and Access program as a student. It's allowed me to gain skills in information technology and also to learn some data entry skills.
Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, I would say that be positive. I think that the thing that disturbs me when I work with families with kids nowadays that are on the spectrum is that the parents are terrified of autism. I know parents that their children are clearly autistic, and yet they won't admit it, or it takes them years before they get interventions because it seems so terrifying that that would be the possibility. And I think part of the problem is we lack information about what happens to autistic individuals when they grow up. And there's very little data on this, and hopefully people are starting to track that information down. But to give you a little bit of information, I found there was a study done in 2003 in Austria tracking down the patients that had gone through the clinic that had been founded by Dr. Hans Asperger. And the woman found 48 of the former patients in adulthood, and the average IQ of that population was 114, so slightly above average. Interestingly, that population had mostly never been told they had autism. And I wonder if that helped with better outcomes. Parent support in that study was not significantly correlated with better outcomes, but what was correlated was having at least one good friend in middle school. Almost 80% of that population were employed when they followed up with them. About 30% were married, about 30% had children, which is not far off the average. The biggest indicator of poor integration into jobs or long-term relationships was low IQ. And life satisfaction for that population was not the same as it was with the general population, but with the Asperger follow-up group, life satisfaction was mainly derived, self-reported, from having an interesting job or a job that they were proud of and being able to engage in their special interest and make contributions to the information or the knowledge that they were trying to obtain. And I think that you as parents or educators tell those kids that they can succeed, especially the ones that are doing okay in high school, doing okay in college. I'm surprised when I hear a kid graduated from UVA and then he's sweeping out a garden center part-time. You need to stretch the kids too. There's a great book by Temple Grandin called Loving Push, and this is a very risk-adverse population, and they will flounder if they're not pushed and supported, but a lot of them will be able to achieve a lot more than people realize if they have that kind of support.
I actually, a couple years ago, wrote a letter to my younger self. I was contacted by a woman who was reading my blog, and she was the mother of a 9-year-old girl who had just been diagnosed. And she reached out to me and suggested that they didn't know any older girls or women on the spectrum, and so she suggested I write this letter to my younger self as a way of giving advice to her daughter and to all of the other children out there on the spectrum and their parents. And I've subsequently read that letter to a number of different audiences. I read it to a group of 600 sixth graders and 600 eighth graders, which is like the hardest audience in the world. And they were swarming me after like I was a Beatle. I felt like Paul McCartney. It was unbelievable. And so I guess the thing that I often try to impart to parents, and it sounds like a cliche, there are no guarantees. There's no guarantee that things will get better, but things can get better. Change is possible. People often think when you get the diagnosis of autism, where your child is, where you are, that's where you're going to be forever, and that's not so. We are able to grow and change as much as anyone else, as neurotypicals. So it is entirely possible for things to get better. We need the right supports in place, we need the right services, we need people backing us up and helping us learn certain skills that we have challenges with. But things absolutely can get better and can change and will not always be at the place that they are right now. So give your child that chance to grow as much as you would a neurotypical child. So thank you all for those excellent answers. That was really great. So, when we talk about disclosure, this is a huge issue, right? How do you disclose that you have autism or are autistic? It's a huge issue. To whom do you disclose? When do you disclose? It can be very challenging to disclose on the job or to a potential romantic partner. How do you tell someone? So, do you feel comfortable telling people that you have autism or that you're autistic? Are there certain situations that you have decided you would feel more comfortable telling people that you do or do not have autism? How do you negotiate the situation of disclosure? Hallie?
Well, I've kind of taken away, especially in the age of social media, the impact of disclosing, because if you Google my name, autism pops up. So for me, I made the choice, I wrote an article in a little college newspaper. I never expected it to be seen outside of my university, and it was, which is the risk you run when you put something like that out there. And it is hard. It's hard when you go on a date and people assume, oh, wow, you're autistic. You can't, function in the normal world, right? Funny, because I have a Juris Doctor. But that is hard, and it's a big part of the work I do today is based around that experience of the ways that people treat you differently when they know. And it may not even be something people are intentionally doing, it's just that bias and it's that stigma that people have and that preconceived notion. So I remember I was in New York, I was visiting a friend, and I was getting dinner with some of her friends who had no idea that I was on the autism spectrum, and they immediately one of her friends started making a joke about a guy she was seeing, oh, he's really awkward and he's kind of weird, I bet he has autism. And they didn't know that I actually had autism. So and obviously the people that I interact with who know don't make jokes like that in front of me, but it kind of makes you wonder, how common is this? And just to see the way that people talk about autism and think about autism when you're not in the room or when they don't know that you're on the spectrum, it concerns me, and it really just shines a light for me on why it's so important that we talk about this and we have open communication about this. I know a couple people in my law school graduating class who have not openly spoken about it because they're aware of the negative stereotypes, they're aware of the potential ramifications, and that breaks my heart. But it's also a very personal decision that everyone has to kind of look in themselves and make, because frankly, there is a stigma and people will treat you differently. So I can't answer that for anyone else on the spectrum, and I think the answer is you have to make that decision and you have to be comfortable with that decision, because it does impact the way that people interact with you.
Thank you, Hallie. Andrew?
I'm honest and comfortable, usually sharing these things about being diagnosed on the spectrum. Different people will answer that question a little bit differently. Sometimes it might help others understand me if I'm in some difficult situations or in stressful situations, so that they're not always uncomfortable with me if I'm, at a place and I get stressed out and, I'm like the person screaming in the room or very loud. Sometimes people might get a little bit nervous. However, I tell them that, I have autism. It might be because of my anxiety as well. So it can help others especially understand me in these stressful situations. I'm pretty honest about it. I open it up usually in my dialogue. Different people can understand this and interpret it differently, and this question in a lot of different ways. I'm Andrew, and I'm not defined by my disability.
Thank you, Andrew. That was great. Great way to end that.
Yeah, I basically have not disclosed just as a general rule, but I disclose if it is relevant to a particular circumstance, just like if someone has lupus or has PTSD from bad childhood events, they don't just walk up to someone and introduce themselves as someone with OCD or PSD or whatever. So I've certainly disclose that to talk to families that need assistance with that sort of thing, or I disclose it if there's a circumstance I can't participate in because of sensory issues or something. But I essentially just let people judge me on my merits and not give them preconceived notions of who I may or may not be.
I oftentimes, I'm in the same boat as Hallie. If you Google me, autism is going to come right up. This is my career. This is what I'm doing, so there's no hiding that. And I used to, for me, the greatest struggle with disclosure was with, potentially with dating. And I would always worry that being autistic, being on the spectrum, made me unlovable or too difficult to love or too difficult to date. I still struggle with that feeling once in a while. However, my confidence has gotten to the point now where I'm basically of the mind that if I tell you that I'm on the spectrum and you don't want to date me, goodbye. I don't have time for you. So it's very much central to what I'm doing as well. And so with jobs, that's also been a challenge, disclosing it there. I mean, I had an unpleasant occurrence when I was at a temp job many years ago, and my coworker disclosed it to my supervisor before I had a chance to. I didn't get to tell her, and then so she had to tell her supervisor, and then they had a meeting, and that upper supervisor decided they didn't need a temp anymore, and I was fired. And so that was extremely disheartening, and I actually kind of left the job world completely for about 5 years after that until I started my business because I was so burned by the experiences that I had. But fortunately, as I say, I'm in a different place now, and so disclosure, yeah, it is kind of based on the situation, but more or less, it's so much a part of who I am and what I'm doing that I don't really feel a need to hide it. So when we talk about inclusion, right, this is such a big word nowadays, inclusion, and a lot of people kind of mix that up with diversity. And the best expression that I have heard to explain the difference is diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance, right? So inclusion and diversity are not the same thing. It's entirely possible to have a diverse group of people at something, but they're not necessarily being included in whatever that function is. So a large part of the event today and what we do is talking about promoting inclusion. And so what are some things that you, my fellow wonderful panelists, think could help promote greater inclusion and acceptance of the autism community in schools, in the workplace, and in the community in general? So Hallie, we'll start with you.
One of the big things, I think, is making sure that there are basic accommodations, especially at the university level, and from employers that help people to be able to successfully, attend college or attend a 2-year university if that's something that they want to pursue, but then also have the chance to find a job and to be included in the workplace environment. There are a lot of really wonderful programs focused now on hiring people with disabilities. But we don't just want a program specifically for hiring people with disabilities. We want programs that are going to help people with disabilities have long, fulfilling careers. We should have, we're missing out on a big portion of our talent pool, and we don't have the population to waste this human capital, to waste this incredible potential that people with disabilities have. And so getting to work on that and work with businesses on developing programs that help them to hire and retain employees with disability through my foundation, the Autism Success Foundation, working with students who are planning to attend college. There's only one university in Virginia that actually has a specialty autism program. And having programs like George Mason has that allow students to attend college and have that little bit of support, that's critical because we're taking kids from K-12 where they've had support, where they've had an individualized education plan, we're sending them to college and they have basically no support. So making sure that we do provide those supports and then we continue to encourage kids while they have these supports to foster those independent living skills, that is critical because we need to make sure that these students not only are graduating from high school, but that they're able to have a long, fulfilling life outside of high school.
Thank you very much. Okay, Andrew?
As far as high school is concerned, there probably needs to be more peer sensitivity training, probably some more education. It could be helpful. I don't really know how to answer that question since I'm not an expert in it, but I could recommend some things that definitely have helped me sort of in high school and in college, the extracurricular activities. So being a part of a sports team and being team manager of the basketball team back in high school really helped me fulfill my enjoyment, and it really got to be it got to be a part of the community, my high school, and everyone knew me, and I had a lot of friends there, and also in college, when I was at the Transition and Access program in Cincinnati at the university there, we had a partnership with Pi Kappa Phi. It's a fraternity which has a philanthropy of the ability experience, and actually one of my buddies used to be the chairperson of it, and we used to form a partnership with them and the university program which I attended. We got events, and it was very nice. And speaking of that, colleges need to have more support programs like tutoring, academic support, supported study tables, and also inclusive environments with peers without disabilities, as well in these social activities. As far as the workplace is concerned, there is really no excuses for not hiring people with disabilities. Yes, we might be in a slow economy since I haven't gotten the reports from local businesses, but that's not my point. My point is there needs to be more opportunities, more companies that recruit people with autism and different types of jobs on the spectrum, because we all might have different abilities to work. For example, I prefer not to be doing farming down in Mexico or working at an auto plant overseas in China. Instead, I prefer to work here in a good paying job in software testing and data entry right here in Virginia that has an inclusive work environment, and maybe a little bit of help with onboarding, training, assistance spading, and follow-up with me. Also, there needs to be more consistency as well with these job recruitment programs. For example, the job recruiting program that helps people with disabilities that obtains jobs in Cincinnati, Ohio, should be the same program that recruits people with disabilities in Anchorage, Alaska, and in Dallas, Texas. And also the same program that exists in New York City should be found in Orlando, Florida, and in Kansas City, Missouri. Well, we all know that's not the case, and it's not consistent throughout the country. So we have to be, we have to be better at it as well. So,
Thank you, Andrew. That was great.
Yeah, I think one of the major impediments to inclusion is stereotyping, where there's a perception that if you hear someone is autistic, that they're going to be cold and oversensitive and incompetent and probably not someone that would be very fun to hang around. And I think that what would help that is we need a better public representation of the diversity of what autistic people can be like and what their contributions are, and how autistic people have made things better. Like a great example is Temple Grandin with revolutionizing how we make livestock holding facilities to minimize stress and fear in the animals, and John Elder Robeson making brand new effect pedals for KISS, and different ways, thousands of different ways that people with autism have made contributions to our society that would give people a better perception of what they're capable of, and then also the differences in different personality types in them. There's a huge array of personality types, and some are quiet, and some are loud, and some talk a lot, and some don't talk at all, and some can be, great friends and fun, and, I think there just needs to be much more diversity in how we see people with autism, so there isn't that perception that it's something to be pitied and avoided.
Piggybacking on that, yes, exactly. Well done. And so that comes with kind of integrating, I think, autistic people into the culture of wherever, be it the culture of the school, the culture of the workplace, right? That's kind of the hardest thing, because you can hire all the people on the spectrum that you want, but that doesn't mean that they're part of that culture that is comprising the work environment, right? Everybody brings something to whatever job they work in, and people on the spectrum have something to bring to jobs as well, but we don't often get to show what that is. We don't often get to have that embraced by others. So, finding ways to incorporate people on the spectrum into that workplace culture, and also make it so that we're able to be upwardly mobile and be in positions of authority as well. And that will help see more of an influence and effect for future people on the spectrum who are looking to become employees. So that's just one potential strategy for improving inclusion in workplaces. So the name of today's event is the Virginia Autism Hope Summit. I don't know if we have any Shawshank Redemption fans here, but hope is a good thing, maybe the best of things, and no good thing ever dies. And we want to take hope with us when we leave here today. We want to take the things we've learned here today back with us to our homes, to our places of employment. And so asking our panel here, and also to share this with all of you, and something you can take with you, what are your hopes for the future? Hallie, we'll begin with you.
Well, one thing I will say, if I have any business owners in this audience, even if it is a slow economy, that's even more reason to hire people who have special needs. 29% revenue increase from businesses that hired individuals with special needs per an Accenture study. So I really don't understand why businesses aren't inclined to hire people with disabilities when A, you're going to make more money, B, you're going to have a happier workforce population overall. And C, it's good for business. Because guess what? Some of your consumers, they have disabilities. Shocker, I know. And I guess my hope is that one day, maybe 10 years from now, maybe 15 years from now, we don't have to ask questions like, when do you disclose that you have autism? I want neurodiversity to be talked about in the sphere of diversity and hiring. I want it to be something that we're focusing on. This is wonderful that we're doing events like this, but I want this to be geared towards how can we make sure that every individual with autism has this incredible life? How can we get these kids, like any other student, any other child that we see that has struggles? Because let's face it, I was a bad kid when I was a kid. I was not, the good kid. I was not the kid that teachers loved. I annoyed most of my teachers. But just because you struggle with something when you're in the 5th, 6th grade doesn't mean that you're going to struggle with something your whole life. I want to get to the point where we're treating these students as kids who may struggle with something, kids who may have a little bit of difficulty with social situations, but kids that we still look at, wow, this child has potential. How do we uncover this potential? How do we help them focus on the things that they're not as strong on and grow even more in the areas that they do have strengths in? How do we take these things that students are struggling with, or that this individual is struggling with, and how do we help them turn it into an opportunity for growth? And I want to see a world where this is not this horrible, awful thing. I want to see a world where we don't have articles, how autism ruined my marriage, or how autism destroyed my child's life. I want to see a world where it's something that, okay, autism is hard. Raising a child is hard, generally, whether they're on the spectrum or not. But this is the steps that we can take to help make sure that this child has as good an opportunity to succeed as any other child.
Thank you, Hallie. Beautiful. Andrew?
So what most people want could probably be my hope. In about a couple weeks, I turned 24 years old, so I'm in my early 20s. I remember when all of you were around my age, and that could have been 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. But what do we all want to have in the life of early adulthood? Well, we probably want to live independently and also get a good paying job, and that I could support myself and have a relationship with a girl and get married and have a family.
Wonderful, Andrew. Thank you.
Welcome.
I would love to see someone, I'm looking at you, Rose, look into the special interests of the higher functioning kids and adults throughout the country and the world and find examples of what they have accomplished, because a lot of these kids develop these special interests, and a lot of parents know about these, but it's like watching cartoons or collecting toys, maybe learning about an animal or learning about batteries or something. But what a lot of parents don't even know is by college age and above, that becomes almost academic style research for a lot of these kids. And a lot of them can spend decades compiling information. And the way the autistic brain works is they're not just mimicking what they're finding, they're collecting certain types of information and then processing it their own way, which means that a lot of them do find new things because they can look at things in a different perspective. And just anecdotally, I've heard, dozens of these stories of, kids that have created new coding breakthroughs. A lot of these kids do computer work. Other kids might be, looking at animals and might determine, something about the range or the behavior of an animal that hasn't been noticed before. Some kids take apart washing machines and, rebuild them and may come up with improvements on it. And I think that a lot of that stuff never comes to light because no one's interested. A lot of the time, the parents have no idea. My parents don't know. I've been collecting information on about 5 topics for 30 years, and I've made multiple breakthroughs, and my parents know nothing about this. And I would love to see, a large-scale study that tries to quantify what those things are, describe them, and maybe hook up some of those kids and adults with researchers in that field to maybe develop that into something useful. I mean, I would remind you that Newton, the scientist who discovered gravity and invented calculus, he invented calculus and never told anyone for 40 years, and it revolutionized how we were able to view the world, and he may well have been on the autism spectrum. And I'm just wondering how many other amazing things are out there sitting on someone's hard drive or in, papers in someone's closet. So that's what I'd like to see.
Thank you so much, Matt. And I guess for me, my hope for the future is that there is hope. Because I remember being a little girl and being suicidal from the age of 10 onward till I was 18 and feeling like there was no hope. And that life was always going to be how it was, that I was always going to be bullied and miserable and hate myself. And there wasn't a lot of hope back then. And my hope is that everyone who was here today knows, whoever you are, wherever you are, that you're not alone. Whether you're a parent, whether you're an individual on the spectrum, whether you're a researcher, you are not alone. Like, we're all in this together. And that was something, that for me was a major struggle growing up, was also feeling very alone, feeling like I was the only one going through what I was going through. We are an enormous community. We may be a minority, maybe it's the folks outside of our community, we're trying to get more noticed by them, but we are here to help each other, and we have to help each other and work together. So my hope is that there is hope. And I'm so grateful to all of you panelists for all of the wonderful insights you've shared with us. And now we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. Thank you very much for that comment. Thank you. We appreciate that. Absolutely agree. Okay. We have a lady right there. Does anyone want to answer that? Andrew? Okay.
Usually I'm pretty tolerant of others, especially, when I was in school. However, it could be, some skills that they're still trying to learn that are not taught, at a very young age, like all those unwritten social rules. And I really think, quite honestly, there are actually 3, different groups of people. There are some friendships that, they're all in their own way. They're pretty outgoing and pretty nice, but they have formed their own silo or their own, network of friends, and they definitely, deserve to have that. I've had a couple of experiences with that in my childhood. I just try to, find the best group of friends that I could possibly have. Also, getting involved in, in these clubs, and then, especially after-school activities, and definitely, learning about, the outside world, and, and developing, some common interests with other people. Quite honestly, I have a lot of friends that, that like basketball, and, and they like to play basketball, and I like to play basketball, so we play pickup basketball occasionally whenever I see my friends again. So I think it differs from every situation, and I think as we start to get older, your kids start to get older, there'll be definitely some more opportunities.
Thank you, Andrew. Hallie?
One thing that helped me as a child, I did a lot of theater classes, and I made sure, okay, I need to learn how to communicate. I need to be twice as good as a communicator, because if people find out, they're going to automatically assume that I can't talk and that I'm so awkward and all these things. So I have to be a good communicator, and I have to be really good at reading people's facial expressions. One of the things that actually really helped me was watching movies and kind of analyzing the different scenes in movies where people would interact, because it kind of, okay, this is how somebody reacts when they're upset, or this is how somebody reacts when they're being mean. And just making sure that your child has an opportunity to learn when people aren't being so nice, because for a lot of students that can be very difficult, and that can put them in potentially dangerous situations later on. So having talks with your child, even though I know it is so beyond difficult about that, it'll really pay off later on, because later in their life, they're going to be faced with potentially dangerous situations, and knowing how to walk away from a situation like that is really critical.
Thank you.
I had an issue with my child when he was in preschool and early elementary school, and the only thing that worked after we did social skills training and all sorts of other things, interventions with teachers, didn't work. The thing that worked is they set up a program where they had several students designated as special friends to my child that would be on the playground with him, or on the bus, or outside the bus when they're going into school, and just keep an eye on him, and then navigate those situations with him. And he learned it better from peers than he did from the artificial social skills training. And then that also had multiple people who would stick up for him if something started to happen, and it worked very well.
Thank you for your question. Any other questions? Andrew?
Good question. I actually spoke about this a little bit earlier, but I remember the moment that it was pretty. I really memorized this moment. This was a crucial moment in my life. I wrote a polite email to a freshman basketball coach who happened to be a teacher at Sycamore when I went to high school in Cincinnati, and I told him that I wanted to be, the basketball team manager, but I didn't know any of the game of basketball or anything about it. I just had a lot of friends, doing it, and I quickly was able to be involved in and started going to some of the games, and they were able to actually work out, a thing. And it's really natural, those types of, of settings, because really teaches, someone on the spectrum about what it's like to, hang out with people and to have a good time, and also to build like work experiences, like taking, statistics, down so you have a lot of work study, skills, and also a lot of friendships, and also, you get taught a lot of things, especially when you're in a part of a team, like good sportsmanship, and how to be polite with your opponents, and how to treat them with respect and dignity, and like everyone, I think it's a lot. A lot of it has to come from a naturalized setting. So.
Thank you, Andrew. Anybody else, or we can just, okay. Any other questions? Oh, I think we have one up here. Okay. Well, I'm certainly aware of the gulf that you're describing. I've seen it on Twitter, especially. I think we all want the same thing. The problem is we have very different ideas of how to go about getting it. And unfortunately, people are a lot of folks who don't have a chance to speak and articulate these things get so very dug in, and they're so attached to, like, no, I have to be able to say this because I don't have that opportunity to say this in any other environment. And so people aren't hearing each other. And that's, I think, the biggest issue. And I think so we need to listen to each other a lot more, and because we're causing so many problems by not doing that. We're wasting time, we're wasting potential of people on the spectrum by having these petty fights. It's it's complex. I mean, it really is very complex because this has been going on a long time. One of the biggest debates is the person first versus identity first language. And I use both. You may have heard me saying person with autism and autistic person. I don't care. I will use both. We have bigger and more important issues to deal with than that. And as always, I say, ask the person themselves how they prefer to identify. But we get caught up. We get caught up in these arguments, unfortunately, and it creates a lot of problems. So we need to get better at listening to each other, in my opinion. But does the rest of the panel have any thoughts on that? Hallie?
I completely agree. I think we tend to get bogged down in some little issues, and I mean, I don't really go on Twitter, so I can't speak to
stay off
the
it. It's
effects
terrible.
of Twitter. For my own sanity, I stay off of Twitter. But I do think we've got to, we have a potential to have a really big lobbying force. We have a potential to be a really big coalition to push policy change, but we're wasting that because we have so much infighting or debates over terminology, little things. At the end of the day, we've got students who are struggling now. We've got students who need supports now. We've got adults with autism who are being diagnosed in their 40s and 50s who need supports now. We don't have time for the petty infighting, and one of the things we really need to do, in my mind, is start to make sure that these two groups of wonderfully dedicated, wonderfully passionate people start working together more and start reaching out to each other, getting involved in advocacy, because I don't believe that this should be people with autism and then parents with autism. It should be everyone who is an advocate for making the world a better place for neurodiversity.
Absolutely. Amen. Okay. Any other questions? Yes, we have. That's a great question. I would say my mother unequivocally supported me. I always knew she was in my corner, even if, when I got into the teenage years especially, I was like, oh, I hate you. You don't want me to be happy. You're, doing all this stuff. And now here I am 20 years later, and I'm like, thank you for caring so much and doing everything that you did. But yeah, just, whatever it was that, she was just this calming force. Like, because my father, when I was diagnosed, he was forced to look back at his own life and realize that he's on the spectrum too. And so we would have a lot of clashes and a lot of things, and she would always end up kind of in the middle. And where he would escalate, she would diffuse. She always knew how to get me off the defensive place that he would put me in. She always knew how to explain things calmly and clearly so that I could understand them, and always made me feel like what I had to say was worthwhile, because there was so many other people who did not make me feel that way. I just hardly ever would speak up. You would think I was very shy at that age, but I think I just ended up in silence because I felt nobody wanted to hear what I had to say. And obviously I'm not shy now, but it was my mother was the one person who always made me feel like what I had to say meant something. So I knew that from early on. So any other panelists have anything to add? Or?
I think it's very important for parents, and I am a parent, to teach their children skills for independent living and for minimizing the social deficits that they might have. And that usually means teaching them politeness rules that you use with friends, you use in the workplace, you use at school, so that there's no way to escape the fact that they're going to appear odd to some people in some situations. But if they can be polite, if they don't interrupt people, if they say thank you, if they're not rude, if they don't monologue. My wife actually gave me a rule a few years ago that I could only say one short sentence at a time and not talk to her for 10 minutes about some extraneous topic. And it's only if there's follow-up questions I can give her another sentence, which hasn't happened yet. But it's those rules that make the child or the adult in the workplace more palatable to mainstream society, which unfortunately is necessary. Yeah. And school is supposed to teach two important things. It's your transcript showing that you're diligent, that you showed up and did the work, and that you're talented, that you did well if you got decent grades. And the component that will help with that is that politeness rule, that you know how what things you can talk about at school or in the workplace. You don't bring up sexual things. You don't bring up complaints about your parents. There's certain things you bring up in certain situations, and there's certain ways you act. And if you can make your child interact with the world in a way that people think is neutral, then they have a better chance of succeeding and not being stigmatized.
Now, to add to that politeness is not the same thing as compliance, right? You can be polite, but you don't always need to be compliant. You shouldn't always, because there are situations where you have to sometimes risk not being polite to speak up for yourself and say, I'm not okay with this, I'm not comfortable with this. We often over-rely on compliance with our individuals on the spectrum, and that can lead to people being in some very dangerous situations. So knowing situationally when it's okay to not be so polite, when it's okay to not be compliant, because that can protect us and save our lives, frankly, in some situations. Okay, I think we have just time for maybe one or two more questions.
Probably just one.
One? Okay. Well, I was extremely sensitive when I was younger, absolutely. It felt like everything was so magnified. Part of that is, being a teenager where everything is the end of the world. All these things, and I look back now and I'm thinking, I got so overwrought over that, like it's nothing. Looking in the rearview mirror, But when you're that age and you're going through it, it can feel extremely intense. And so yes, I was like very hypersensitive when I was younger. I'm still kind of a crier. I still get emotional sometimes, but I've learned some degrees of emotional control as I've gotten older. It's just a function of getting older, learning techniques and coping mechanisms. But I don't think it's a bad thing to be sensitive necessarily. I think it can actually be an asset instead of a liability in certain circumstances. So it's just a matter of learning those strategies and learning how to deal with it. But any other panelists have anything you want to share? Hallie?
For the first year after I was diagnosed, I was just mad. I was really just upset about this diagnosis. It took about 3-4 years for me actually to get diagnosed properly. I had an assortment of other things that I was initially diagnosed with, but I was mad. I felt like, oh great, I have autism, I'm gonna be socially awkward, I read all these articles online. I made it my point to learn everything I could possibly learn about autism. And of course, you find all these things online like, oh, if you have autism, don't marry somebody with autism, they're gonna be horrible. There's a whole website about that. Autism ruined my marriage, so of course I became concerned that I was gonna ruin my parents' marriage. I didn't, they're still happily married. All these years later, did not ruin their marriage.
Mine too, 48 years.
But it's very hard, and I think it's so hard for a lot of children or even adults who are diagnosed because that's the type of material we have out there about what autism is. And that's why it's really important that we start to shine a more positive light on what the potential is and look more towards what the potential of this population is versus the limitations of this population. Because there is so much potential there. And there is so much possibility. It's just a matter of tapping into that. Heck, some historians think George Washington had autism. So he clearly had a big impact on our country. So I think that there's a lot that we can continue to do to make sure that we are supporting people with autism, and we are making sure that this is not seen as such a terrible thing. And that's going to really play a role in how people on the spectrum perceive themselves and perceive their potential.
Well, thank you so much, Hallie. I want to thank my fellow panelists. Round of applause. And thank you all so much for being here today. We really appreciate it.